Welcome to Jewish History from the Inside Out. The Philistines, strangers in our midst. This episode is dedicated in loving memory of Shneor Zalman Olav HaShalom ben Harav Mנחem Mendel Sheyichya. May his memory be a blessing. In this two-part mini-series, we discuss the origins and iterations of this age-old and enigmatic enemy of the Jewish people, and the application of this knowledge to our times. In light of recent horrors carried out from that narrow patch of land in the south of Israel, known as the Gaza Strip, which once housed the cruel and vicious Philistines, this endeavor has grown ever more relevant. The Medrash on Parshas Shlach states, "There are lands that produce mighty men, and lands that produce weaklings." Elsewhere, it is written, "There are lands that produce wise men, and lands that produce fools." The atmosphere of a land very much impacts the nature of its inhabitants. An understanding of the character of its past inhabitants will afford us insight into the nature of its current occupants. Although the original nations have long been replaced by others, point in case, today's Gazans bear no relation to the original Philistines, they will still exhibit some of the same qualities of the original people whose lands they inhabit. Learning about the Philistines of old will inform our attitude vis-a-vis today's, quote, Palestinians. This two-part series is divided as follows. In Episode 1, we discussed the migrations of various people to and from the land of Plishtim, or Philistia. As we will discover, there never was a nation indigenous to this land. Since time immemorial, it had always been settled by foreign invaders and diffuse nationalities. In Episode 2, we consider the spiritual aspect of the Philistines and its application to today's day and age. It turns out that there are some very relevant and actionable lessons we can glean from history and apply to our current situation. Part 1, Early Origins. The name Plishtim, Philistines, appears almost 300 times in Tanakh, always in a negative context. The first mention of the nation of the Philistines is in Parshas Noach, and they are last mentioned by the prophet Yecheskel in a prophecy about the end of days. From the early days of the patriarchs to the conquest of Israel by Yehoshua, throughout the period of the judges, all the way down to Kings Shaul and David, the Philistines exist as a perpetual thorn in the side of the Jewish people. Whence did they first appear on the world stage? In the list of nations in Parshas Noach, the Plishtim are counted among the descendants of Mitzrayim, the second son of Cham ben Noach. 7 families descended from Mitzrayim, who settled along the northern coast of the African continent and southward along the Nile River to Ethiopia. Bereshis chapter 10, verses 13 and 14 read as follows, quote, "And Mitzrayim bore Ludim and Anomim and Lahovim and Naftuchim, and Pasrusim and Kasluchim, the Plishtim issued forth from there, and Kaftorim." A plain reading of the verse would imply that the Plishtim were a subgroup of Kasluchim, who, for one reason or another, left their homeland and settled on the southern coast of Canaan. Rashi, however, quoting the Medrash, informs us that Pasrusim and Kasluchim would share their wives with each other, and the Plishtim, quote, issued forth from the both of them. According to the Medrash, it would seem, the pasuk is informing us not so much from where, but rather from who the Plishtim emerged. Upon deeper reflection, though, I believe Rashi does not mean to negate the simple meaning of the verse, that the Plishtim left the North African mainland. Rather, he is providing the context in which that event occurred. Most scholars take Pasrus to refer to the southern part of Egypt, known as Upper Egypt, bordering on the Sudan, while Kasluach refers to eastern Libya, west of Egypt, known in ancient times as the Pentapolis. The two regions meet at the southeast corner of Kasluach and the northwest corner of Pasrus. According to the Medrash, the inhabitants of this border area between Pasrus and Kasluach engaged in the indecent custom of wife-swapping and produced offspring of questionable patrilineage. Now surely not all Pasrusim and Kasluchim engaged in such licentiousness, or else in the course of a few generations the two nations would have merged into one, and would have ceased to exist as distinct entities. I would offer then that the legitimate offspring of Pasrusim and Kasluchim shunned these misbegotten Plishtim, and that neither group would allow them to settle in their land. This brings to mind the incident with the son of Shlemis Bas Divri, who was prevented by the tribe of Dan from pitching his tent in their territory on account of his Egyptian father. The Plishtim were therefore forced to search for a new home, and they landed on the southern coast of Canaan and named it Pleshes, Philistia. This territory extended from Rafah in the south to Gaza in the north, what is known today as the Gaza Strip. But here we run into a bit of a problem. Notwithstanding that the Torah explicitly states the Plishtim emerged from Kasluchim, and the Medrash interprets this to include the Pasrusim as well, the prophets Amos and Yirmiyah clearly refer to the Plishtim as migrants from the land of Kaftor. God shall plunder the Plishtim, remnant of the Isle of Kaftor, laments Yirmiyah. And the prophet Amos declares, Have I not brought Israel up from Egypt, the Plishtim from Kaftor, and Aram from Kir? Kaftor is neither Kasluach nor Pasrus. Some commentaries, including Ramban, seek to resolve this discrepancy by interpreting the verse in Bereshis to read, quote, And Pasrusim and Kasluchim, the Plishtim and Kaftorim, issued forth from there. In this re-rendering, the Plishtim and Kaftorim are presented as sister nations, both of whom emerged from illegitimate relations between Pasrusim and Kasluchim. The difficulty with this retranslation is that if that were indeed the case, the verse should have read, Asher yotzu mishom Plishtim v'Kaftorim. This would designate the Plishtim and Kaftorim as a pair that issued from the Pasrusim and Kasluchim. The actual reading, Plishtim v'es Kaftorim, indicates that the phrase Asher yotzu misham Plishtim, the Plishtim issued forth from there, is parenthetical, and that Kaftorim are in fact the seventh family of Mitzrayim. At any rate, this is clearly how Rashi reads the verse. Let us take another look at the aforementioned verse from Amos. The verse mentions three nations, all of whom were, quote, brought up from other lands. Israel from Egypt, Plishtim from Kaftor, and Aram from Kir. Regarding Israel and Aram, we are told explicitly in Tanakh that they had previously been exiled from their homelands. Israel from Canaan to Egypt, and Aram from Aram to Kir. God then brought them back from their places of exile to their original homelands. It would therefore stand to reason that the third nation mentioned in the same context, in the same verse, in between Israel and Aram, namely the Plishtim, were also exiled from Pleshes to Kaftor, and later returned to their original homeland, Pleshes. Issue resolved. So far, so good. But wait. Prophets Tzfanya and Yecheskel cite not Kaftor, but Kresim, universally identified with Crete, a large island in the central Mediterranean, as the origin of the Plishtim. Tzfanya says, "Woe, you who dwell on the coastland, people of Kresim. Here is Hashem's word to you, Canaan, land of the Plishtim. I will leave you desolate with no inhabitants." Similarly, Yecheskel, echoing Tzfanya, declares, "So says Almighty God, behold, I will extend my hand unto the Plishtim, and I will cut off Kresim, and destroy the remnant of the coastland." Many modern scholars conflate Kaftor and Kresim, suggesting that both designations refer to Crete and are thus interchangeable. From a traditional Torah point of view, such a position appears untenable. Kaftor and Kresim are clearly two distinct locales, as will be demonstrated in the course of this podcast. We are therefore forced to conclude that at some point in history, Pleshes was invaded by a people from the land of Kresim, who then integrated into and merged with the returnees from Kaftor. Exactly when that great sea migration occurred and the circumstances that led up to it are not entirely clear. To summarize thus far, the nation of the Plishtim originated in northern Africa, migrated to and settled in the southern coastal region of Canaan, were exiled to Kaftor, and later returned to Pleshes, ultimately integrating and merging with sea migrants from Crete. Let us now consider the following questions. 1. Why were the Plishtim exiled to Kaftor? 2. What initiated their return to Pleshes? 3. Who inhabited the land in the interim? And 4. Where, for that matter, is Kaftor? Part 2. Snakes. Devarim 2:23 states, quote, "And the Avim who dwelt in Chatzerim until Gaza, Kaftorim who left Kaftor, annihilated them and dwelt in their place." This is the first biblical mention of an unknown people, the Avim, who inhabited a narrow strip of land that extended from Chatzerim in the south to Gaza City in the north. Onkelos and Rasag both translate Chatzerim as Rafiach, the city of Rafah. This region, known today as the Gaza Strip, was inhabited in ancient times by the nation of the Avim. Who were these mysterious Avim? Where did they come from? And what was their connection to the Plishtim? Targum Yonason translates Avim as Ushar Peletas Knaanoi, the leftover Canaanites who were expelled. These were a group of Canaanites who were expelled from their land of origin and settled in the Gaza Strip. At first glance, this identification seems rather problematic. The Torah clearly demarcates the territory of Canaan as extending, quote, from Tzidon in the north, southward in the direction of Gror, until Gaza, end quote. Gror is south of Gaza, in between Gaza and Rafah. The Canaanites settled along the road to Gror, never quite reaching it, going south only as far as Gaza. How then could the Avim, who lived south of Gaza, be classified as Canaanites? The Gemara in Tractate Chulin, quoting Reish Lakish, says, quote, "The Avim are the Plishtim." This too is difficult to understand. After all, the verse quoted above states unequivocally that the Kaftorim, presumably a reference to the Plishtim returning from their exile in Kaftor, destroyed the Avim. According to the Amora Rav, the Avim came from Teiman. Teiman is a region in the south of Israel, in what was known in ancient times as the land of Edom. Teiman was a son of Eliphaz, a grandson of Esav. Among the kings who ruled Edom, we find Husham from the land of Teiman. We also find Hadad ben Bedad from the city of Avis, which Avis would presumably mean city of the Avim. By the way, this does not necessarily mean the Avim descended from Esav, although see Rashi to Chulin 60b. It is possible that they predated Esav in an area that would come to be known as Teiman some generations later. Rav's opinion regarding the Avim is supported by a brisa, which reads as follows, quote, "The Avim came from Teiman. And why were they called Avim? Because their place of origin was obliterated, Ivus. Alternatively, they were called Avim because anyone who beheld them was gripped by Avis, fear." End quote. The Amora Rav Yosef said, "Each one of them possessed 16 rows of teeth." Chassam Sofer explains that teeth is a metaphor for an army which consumes or destroys. The Avim had 16 armies, as alluded to by their name, Avim, which is the same letters as Am Yudvav, a nation of 16. Medrash Rabbah explains that they were called Avim because they could discern the qualities of the earth like a snake. In the Galil, the Medrash continues, Chivia, snakes, are called Ivia. This brings to mind the Gemara in Tractate Shabbos, quoted by Rashi, on the pasuk, "These are the children of Seir, the Choiri, who dwelt on the land." The Gemara there asks, does the rest of the world dwell in the heavens? Rather, the Gemara answers, this nation, the Choiri, were exceptionally keen in regards to the earth upon which they dwelt. They would say, "This plot of land is fit to grow olives. This plot of land is fit for grapes. This plot of land is fit for figs." Therefore, they are here called Choiri, because they would sniff, merichin, the earth, and are elsewhere called Chivi, because they would taste the earth like snakes, Chivia. According to this Gemara, the original inhabitants of Seir/Edom/Teiman were known as the Choiri or the Chivi. Ramban, on the earlier verse from Dvarim, ties all of the pieces together for us. He explains as follows. At the Bris Bein Hapsarim, the covenant between the parts, Hashem promised Avraham the land of the 10 nations of Canaan, 7 of which the Jews would conquer upon entry into the land of Canaan under Yehoshua. The remaining 3, Keni, Knizi, and Kadmoni, would be inherited in the days of Mashiach. The 7 nations are usually enumerated as Kanani, Chiti, Emoiri, Prizi, Chivi, Yevusi, and Girgashi. Tellingly, though, at the Bris Bein Hapsarim, Chivi is omitted, and in its place there appears the nation of Rephaim. Who are the Rephaim? In Devarim 2:11 and 20, we find the Rephaim associated variously with the Amim, Zamzumim, and Anokim, all nations of giants. This leads the Medrash to conclude that the Amim, Rephaim, Zamzumim, Anokim, and Avim are all one and the same. To summarize, Teman, in the vicinity of Mount Seir, was originally inhabited by the Chori or Chivi. The Chivi are elsewhere identified with the Avim and Rephoim, who are in turn identified with the nations of Emim, Anokim, and Zuzim, or Zamzumim. The lands of the Rephoim extended all along the eastern and southern perimeter of Canaan, in the areas that would later come under the control of nations such as Ammon, Moav, and Edom. The various names of the Avim, Chivi, Chori, and Rephoim, says Ramban, all point to a single entity, snakes. Ivio and Chivio are interchangeable. Both mean snakes. Chori means holes, and Rephoim are ruins. Both are places where snakes are likely to reside. The lands of the Chivi Rephoim encircled the perimeter of the land of Canaan. Interestingly, the Chivi snake is the only one of the 7 nations of Canaan that was not completely conquered by the Jewish people, as a number of their territories were absorbed by Ammon, Moav, Edom, and the Plishtim. It is perhaps for this reason that we read every day in davening, V'chorois imoy habris, loses es eretz haknani, hachiti, ho'emoiri, haprizi, hayevusi, v'agirgoshi, loses lezaroi, v'atokim es divorecho ki tzadikoto. You established the covenant with Avram to give him the lands of the Canaani, Chiti, Emoiri, Prizi, Yevusi, and Girgashi, and you fulfilled your promise, for you are righteous. Wait, isn't there one missing? That's right, the Chivi. In light of the above, this is readily understood. The Chivi snake was only partly conquered. The remaining territory, originally under its dominion, will be conquered fully only in the time to come, in the days of Mashiach. In summary, the original land of the Plishtim extended from Rafah in the south to Gaza in the north. In a word, the Gaza Strip. Its inhabitants were the illegitimate offspring of Pasrusim and Kasluchim, who migrated to southern Canaan from the African continent. Reaching Canaan, by land, by sea, or both, they established the land of Pleshus. Some centuries later, the Avim, a nation of the Chivi clan, who lived in an area later known as Teman, vanquished the original Plishtim and banished them to the land of Kaftar. Eventually, the Plishtim returned from Kaftar and destroyed the Avim, reclaiming their land. They expanded the territory of Pleshus further north and east, all the way to the city of Ekron. Part 3, the War of the 4 and the 5. When did the Avim migrate from Teman to the land of the Plishtim? In ancient times, population changes were usually the result of major disasters. Disasters are basically of 2 varieties, natural and man-made. Natural disasters include famines, floods, earthquakes, etc. And man-made disaster? This, of course, means war. In the case of the Avim, the event that precipitated their move may be right there in front of us, stated explicitly in the Torah. Far from the land of Canaan, in modern-day Iran, called Elam in ancient times, there lived the arch-enemy of the Avim, a man by the name of Kedar Laomer. The reason for his enmity is not clearly stated in the Torah, but I would venture it had something to do with a large sum of money Kedar Laomer had been collecting from the metropolis of Sodom and Amorah, and which they had abruptly stopped paying. Why did Sodom and Amorah suddenly stop offering tribute to Kedar Laomer? I believe this had something to do with the mighty snake people, the Chivi Rephoim. These giants exerted intense pressure on the Sodomites to switch their allegiance from the Elamites to the Rephaim. The Rephaim stood between Canaan and Elam, and could thus protect the Sodomim against foreign threats. Because the Rephaim were closer to the Sodomim than was Elam, incurring their wrath might very well be perceived as a more immediate and dangerous threat than the risk of angering the Elamites. All of these considerations eventually convinced the Sodomim to switch their loyalties and their taxes from Kedar La'omer to the Rephaim giants. Kedar La'omer, as you might imagine, was none too pleased at this development. However, a practical man by nature, he bided his time and spent the next 13 years building a coalition with the powerful nations of Shinar, Elosar, and Goyim. Finally, he felt secure enough to take on the mighty Chivi Rephaim and their protectorate, Sodom and Amorah, and he set out on a campaign towards Canaan. This explains the battle route chosen by Kedar La'omer and his confederates, as described in Bereshis. Quote, "And in the 14th year, Kedar La'omer arrived with the other kings in tow. First, the pasuk tells us, he struck the Rephaim in Ashtaros Karnaim. Next, he vanquished the Zuzim in Hum. The Zuzim, also called Zamzumim in Devarim, were also considered Rephaim, as clearly stated there. He then beat the Amim in Shavei Kiryasayim. The Amim, as stated in Devarim, were merely another branch of the family of Rephaim. Lastly, he destroyed the Chayri on Mount Seir. The Chayri Chivi, as we have already learned, are part of the Rephaim snake clan as well. Why would Kedar La'omer engage and attack all of the various factions of the Chivi Rephaim on his campaign against Sodom and Amorah? In light of what has been explained above, it all makes sense. Kedar La'omer's war was waged primarily against the Rephaim clan, for it was they who had instigated the rebellion of Sodom and Amorah, diverting their tribute from Elam to themselves. Furthermore, Kedar La'omer could not attack Sodom and Amorah directly without first having destroyed the Rephaim, or else the latter would come to their aid. Only after he had successfully vanquished the Rephaim could the 4 kings attack the 5 kings of Sodom and Amorah, who were now without protection. The southernmost group of the Rephaim Chivi clan was the Avim. Witnessing the defeat of their fellow clansmen one after another at the hands of Kedar La'omer's coalition, they saw what was coming, and they upped and fled west towards the land of Plishtim. Kedar La'omer did indeed reach Teman and destroyed it. This is the meaning of the Gemara in Chulin, which states, why were they called Avim? Because their place of origin was obliterated. Reaching Plishtim, the Avim ousted the Plishtim from Rafah to Gaza, which Plishtim then fled to Kaftar. If our chronology is correct, it would then emerge that the Plishtim of Avraham and Yitzchak, that is, Avimelech 1 and 2, and General Pikol, all of whom lived in Gerar, between Rafah and Gaza, were not of the original Plishtim of Mitzrayim, but rather the Avim Chivi who ousted them. This would also explain why the Bris Ben Hapsarim, the covenant between the parts, took place, according to most commentaries, immediately after the war of the 4 and the 5 kings. Up until that point, the land of the Plishtim did not belong to the children of Canaan, but to the children of Mitzrayim. Had the covenant been established prior to that war, it would not have included the land of the Plishtim. It was only after the Chivi snake people conquered the area and it came under Canaanite dominion that it fell under the purview of the covenant. Approximately 25 years later, when Sodom and Amorah were finally destroyed, Avraham sought refuge in the land of the Avim Plishtim. Instead of welcoming with open arms the man who had defeated their enemies, the ungrateful Avim rejected Avraham and his son Yitzchak, harassing them and filling their wells with earth. Part 4. The Return of the Plishtim. The original Plishtim of the Gaza Strip settled into the land of Kaftar for the long haul. They assimilated to some degree or another and intermarried with the populace. Biding their time, they waited patiently for the opportune moment when they could once again return to their land. The ancients had long memories. Eventually, that moment did arrive. As the pasuk states, quote, "And the Avim who lived between Chatzerim and Gaza were annihilated by Kaftorim who left Kaftar and who settled in their place. The Plishtim Kaftorim destroyed the Plishtim Avim and re-inhabited the coastland." The fact is that the Avim were not entirely obliterated, but rather displaced and absorbed by the Plishtim, in much the same way that the Choiri were absorbed by Esav and his descendants when they conquered Mount Seir. Esav and his firstborn Eliphaz both married Choiri Chivi women, and the local population became integrated with the Edomites. For this reason, we find Avim still mentioned in Sefer Yeshua long after the return of the Plishtim. When exactly did the return of the Plishtim transpire? Unclear. The only thing we know for certain is that it occurred prior to the entry of the Jewish people into the land of Canaan, as the destruction of the Avim is mentioned in the Torah, which was written by Moshe in advance of the Jews' conquest of Canaan. The period of the Exodus was a time of upheaval for the entire civilized world. It was not only the Jews who left Mitzrayim at Yitzias Mitzrayim, but many other nations as well. As the verse states, "V'gam erev rav ola itam," and a great multitude ascended with them. Just how great was this multitude? The Mechilta quotes 3 opinions. It was either twice, 4 times, or 6 times the entire population of the Jewish people. Such a mass migration would undoubtedly have impacted the entire family of nations. The destruction of the Avim may very well have come about as a consequence of the Exodus. This would also explain the intense fear of the nations of Canaan and its neighbors described in Oz Yashir, which Moshe and the Jews sang when they ascended from the Sea of Reeds. Alternatively, the return of the Plishtim may have occurred some 30 years earlier and may have precipitated the premature campaign of the Bnei Ephraim against the inhabitants of the land of Plishtim. That campaign was a failure, and the Bnei Ephraim were killed by the people of Gas, one of the 5 fortified cities of the Plishtim. Or else the Plishtim's return may have transpired at some undetermined earlier date in the preceding century. Said Rab Shimon ben Lakish in Tractate Chulin, "There are a number of verses in the Torah that deserve to be burnt, like the books of Homer, since they appear to convey frivolous bits of information, and yet they are themselves the essence of Torah. For example, the verse states, 'And the Avim who lived between Chatzerim and Gaza were annihilated by Kaftorim who left Kaftar and who settled in their place.' What practical difference does this make for us? The answer is, since Avimelech, king of the Plishtim, administered an oath to Avraham, that he commit no treason against me, my children, or my grandchildren, Therefore Hashem said, "Let the Kaftorim come out and oust the Avim," that is, the Plishtim, "and let the Jews come and oust the Kaftorim." The Torah refers to all inhabitants of a particular land as being of that land. Therefore, the Avim, who settled in the land of the Plishtim, were thereafter called Plishtim in the Torah. Now Avram had sworn a two-part oath to Avimelech, king of the Plishtim Avim. First, that he would not go to war against him or any of his descendants for 3 generations. And second, that he would never take his land. Avimelech's son, Avimelech II, renewed that covenant with Avram's son, Yitzchak. Therefore, in order for the Jews to be allowed to conquer the land of the Avim, it first had to be conquered by the Plishtim of Kaftor. Only afterwards would the Jews be permitted to conquer it, since at that point it would no longer be considered to belong to Avimelech. A fascinating point emerges from all of this. The Gaza Strip had twice to be conquered before the Jews could take it. First, it had to be conquered by the Avim Chivi, so that it could be considered part of Canaan and be included in the Bris Ben Hapsarim. But then, on account of Avram's oath to Avimelech, it had to be wrested away from them by the Kaftorim, so that it could ultimately be conquered by the Jews. Now at some point, a horde of new migrants from the island of Crete washed up on the shores of Israel. Presumably, these Cretans then assimilated into the local population and were absorbed into the Plishtim, integrating with them and evolving into the Neo-Philistine Confederacy of the 5 city-states of Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Gas, and Ekron. Exactly when the Cretan invaders first landed on the southern coast is unknown, but it must have occurred, at the very latest, half a century before Shaul's ascent to the throne of Israel. This general date is based partly on the Navi's description of Goliath's vestments, which exhibits certain Aegean features, like the spear across his shoulders and the suit of armor. Additionally, at the time of Shaul's death, a few short years later, the verse speaks of the Negev Hakresi, the Cretan south of Israel. And in the generation that followed, we find units of Cretan soldiers under the command of David's general, Benayahu ben Yehoiada. To have sufficiently settled by then, the newcomers from Crete must have arrived in Israel at the very latest, at least half a century earlier. Part 5, The Quest for Kaftor. The precise location of the ancient land of Kaftor is an enigma that has stymied scholars for generations. We will now set out on a quest for the long-lost land of Kaftor. Our search will take us across oceans and continents, turning up clues in the strangest of places, until our gaze finally settles upon the land of Kaftor. At first glance, though, does it not seem like we're being perhaps a little too dramatic? It is hard to understand what all the fuss is about. If you were searching for ancient Kaftor, what is the first source you would consult for information? The Targumim, of course, the various Aramaic translations of the Torah. A quick perusal of these informs us that on the point of Kaftor, all are in agreement. Targum Onkelos, Yonasan ben Uziel on the Torah, and Targum Yonasan on Navi all translate Kaftor as Kaput Kiya with a tes, or Kapoit Kiya with a dalid. Now, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, in his Rishimis, as well as his father, Reb Levik in Lekutei Levi Yitzchak, are both emphatic on the point that this single letter discrepancy is insignificant and the spellings are interchangeable. Indeed, Reb Leivik even explains the basis for the dual spelling according to Kabbalah. So all we need to do is locate Kaputkia on an ancient map, and we will have found our land of Kaftar. Right? Kaputkia, as it turns out, is surprisingly easy to locate. It is referenced extensively in Talmud's Bavli and Yerushalmi, as well as in various midrashim. In Yerushalmi and Medrash Rabbah, we find mention of Rabbi Yudin and Rabbi Shmuel of Kaputkia. In various braises in the Gemara, we are told that the Tanoim Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Nosson, and Rabbi Akiva all visited there. There is even mention of a city, Mazeka, in Kaputkia, which was home to a large Jewish community. The country known to Chazal as Kaputkia, and to the Greeks as Cappadocia or Cappadocia, is located in an ancient region of Asia Minor in the modern-day country of Turkey. More precisely, it is located in the northeastern part of that region between the Taurus Mountains and the Black Sea. It should be noted that while the Greeks referred to it as Cappadocia with a dalid, its earlier Persian name was Katpatuka with a tes. So not only are the two names interchangeable, but both are historically correct and were applied to the region by two distinct peoples, the Persians and the Greeks. Remember the association of Peleshis and snakes? Well, the ancient region of Cappadocia contains no less than 200 underground cities. Apparently, the people there live partly in underground tunnels, like snakes. The rather straightforward association of Kaftar with Cappadocia is not without its difficulties. Firstly, how did Kaftorim of Egyptian stock end up settling in European Asia Minor? And on the other side of the Taurus Mountains, no less. This, of course, means that the Plishtim somehow ended up there as well. Why would the Plishtim travel to such a remote land relatively inaccessible from its southern border? The Cappadocian connection seems untenable in the face of the geographic reality. As for the tunnel cities, according to scholars, these were built centuries after the Plishtim hailed from Kaftar to Pleshis. Besides, all of the ancient human remains unearthed in Cappadocia indicate that they were of Indo-European descent, that is, from the children of Yefes, not Chum. But an even greater problem looms above all. The verse in Yirmiyah clearly refers to Kaftar, the island of Kaftar. Cappadocia is not an island. It is part of the Turkish peninsula. It is mainly this designation of Kaftar as an island that has led many scholars to identify Kaftar with Crete. The assumption, as mentioned earlier, is that Kaftar and Kresim are synonymous. Indeed, a number of ancient Egyptian inscriptions refer to the Kaftiu, a people some believe to have resided in the island of Crete. Also, according to many scholars, the chief deity of ancient Cretan Minoan civilization was associated with none other than the snake. Can it really be? Are Kresim and Kaftar really one and the same? In the book of Shmois, the Torah tells us that the menorah contained a number of ornamental carvings, among them kaftorim, buttons. The kaftorim are described in Tractate Menachos as tapuchim keresim, Cretan apples. I know this association of Kaftar and Kresim is merely circumstantial, but it is tempting nonetheless. Enticing as this theory may be, we still need to contend with the Targumim, all of whom, as mentioned, translate Kaftar as Kaputkia. Oh, and the Cretan apples? In a number of editions of the Gemara, as also in the authoritative Teiman edition of the Rambam, the text reads Tapuchim Beiroisim, that is, Beirutian apples, i.e., apples from Beirut. So much for that. We seem to have arrived at a dead end. Kaputkia, the location of which is well known, appears to be wholly unconnected to the Plishtim, nor is it an island. The island of Crete, on the other hand, for all of its Philistine association, is decidedly not Kaputkia. Let us turn our attention for a moment to Rambam's commentary on the Mishnah at the end of Tractate Ksubos. There, the Mishnah discusses the currency of Kaputkia, which is more weighty than the currency of the land of Israel. In Rambam's own words, Kaputkia, that is, kafter, is called tamiyati in Arabic. It is not far from Israel. The Tafsir, Reb Sadia Gaon's 10th century Arabic translation of Tanakh, also renders ve'es kaftorim as wa'el damiyatun. Who are the tamiyati, damiyatun, supposedly living right under our nose, not far from the land of Israel? Binyamin of Tudela was a 12th century Jewish-Spanish explorer who visited the far-flung Jewish communities of Europe, Asia, and Africa. His travels took him to the land of Egypt and down the Nile River. Binyamin writes, "When the Nile River, flowing south to north from Ethiopia, reaches the land of Egypt, it splits into a number of branches. One branch extends towards Damiyat, namely Kafter. Damiyat, or Kafter, is a district in Egypt, which carries the name Damietta to this very day, although modern Damietta is merely a fraction of the original district that bore its name. The original inhabitants of Damietta were an ancient people known as the Copts, or the Coptics. Let's try this now. Copt, Coptic, Kaputkia. There you have it. Furthermore, the modern-day name Egypt is derived from the Greek name Aegyptis. This itself was a corruption of the ancient Egyptian name Hat Kapta, meaning land of the spirit of an Egyptian deity, as the consonants g and k are interchangeable. Let us try this now together. Ekiptu, Ekuftu, Kafter. Bingo! Kaftorim who left Kafter, that is, Coptics who hailed from Kaputkia. But wait, did we not say the island of Kafter? Damietta, much like Cappadocia, is not an island, but a part of the Egyptian peninsula. The truth is that this problem is easily resolved. The word although generally translated as island, does not necessarily warrant the area be surrounded by water on all four sides. Any region located on the water may properly be termed an Proof of this is the verse in Yirmiyah in which the prophet refers to the citizens of Israel as Yoshvei Ho'i Hazeh, the inhabitants of this The 13th century commentator Radak, Reb David Kimchi, explains that Israel can properly be termed an since it borders the Mediterranean Sea. This is doubly true of a peninsula, a territory surrounded by water on three sides, like Turkey, Greece, Italy, and even Lower Egypt. Ancient Damietta, bounded as it was by the Nile River that runs to the sea, can certainly be designated an In the last century, ancient Egyptian inscriptions have been discovered in which this territory is referred to as none other than Kafter. When the Plishtim were ousted from Pleshis by the Avim, they took up refuge in Kaftor, just south of the land of Canaan. Kaftor, Damietta, and Kaputkia of the Targum all conclusively refer to the northern district of Egypt in the fertile Nile Delta. There is indeed a second Kaputkia, known as Cappadocia, in Asia Minor. In general, whenever the name Kaputkia is used in the Gemara, it is this northern region that is being referenced. Nevertheless, the Kaputkia of Kaftor is on the Egyptian peninsula. Part 6. Decline and Fall. The Philistine Confederacy, which comprised the 5 city-states of Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gas, along with numerous other towns and villages, reached the zenith of its power right around the advent of the Jewish monarchy. Shimshon, the last of the judges, had sufficiently cowed the Philistines, but had not diminished their political strength. It was left to King Shaul, his son Yonasan, and his son-in-law David to cast off the Philistine yoke from the necks of the Jewish people. Although Shaul and Yonasan were ultimately killed in the effort, the Philistine hold on the Jews had been broken. David picked up where Shaul and Yonasan had left off, completely removing any remnant of Philistine rule from the Jewish nation. Although the Jews had broken free from them, the Philistines remained a force to contend with from within their fortified cities for another 2 centuries. King Uzziyahu of Yehuda was the first to breach the wall of Gas, and it was finally destroyed in the time of his great-grandson Chizkiyahu. From that point on, we are informed by Seder Olam, although the Philistines continued to exist, quote, they did not appoint a king, nor did they raise their head again. This somewhat cryptic statement may be properly understood as follows. As mentioned, the Philistine Confederacy comprised 5 main cities. Out of the 5, Gas was considered their capital. In fact, Gas is the only Philistine city Tanakh mentions as having a king. Around the time of Chizkiyahu, Sargon, who was king of Ashur right before Sancherib, destroyed the cities of Gas and Ashdod. From that time on, Gas was never heard of again. Ashdod was resettled by Sargon with captives from some eastern provinces, as was the custom of the kings of Ashur to relocate peoples they had conquered as a means of asserting their control. We know all of this from an inscription discovered at the palace of King Sargon near Mosul, Iraq. After that, it appears Gaza replaced Gas as the Philistine capital, but it never did garner the same prestige as the old capital. This then is the meaning of the Seder Olam statement that from the days of Chizkiah onward they did not appoint a king, nor did they raise their head. 3 out of the 4 remaining Philistine city-states, Ashdod, Ekron, and Ashkelon, were destroyed in the years preceding the destruction of the temple by Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. Ashkelon was first to go, then Ashdod and Ekron. Gaza was the last of the Philistine cities to fall. It was finally conquered by Pharaoh Khafra exactly 1 year before the Churban. Part 7, Postscript. Let us summarize what we've learned. The original Plishtim, illegitimate offspring of Pasrus and Kasluach, first settled in the Gaza Strip and bequeathed upon it its name, Pleshis. The Avim of the Chivi Rephoim snake clan, descendants of Canaan who mingled with giants, abandoned their homeland Teman during the War of the 4 and 5 Kings and ousted the Plishtim. It is the Avim who are the Plishtim of Avram and Yitzchak. The original Plishtim fled to their cousins in Kaftir, mingling and assimilating with them to some degree or another. At a certain point, the original Plishtim and their cousin nation, the Kaftirim, launched an assault against the Avim. The Avim were routed, and the Plishtim retook Pleshus, expanding the land of the Philistines northward toward Ashkelon and Ashdod. Later, a new people arrived from Crete and assimilated with the Plishtim. They left a powerful imprint on the land of Pleshus, evolving into the Neo-Philistine confederacy of the 5 city-states, extending all the way from Raphah in the south to Ekron in the north. Already in the days of Shaul and David, Philistine power had begun to wane. It was dealt a mortal blow by the Assyrians along with the kings of Yehudah, and continued to decline until the last city-states were destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar and Pharaoh Khafra. I should be remiss if I do not mention another possibility that I find tantalizingly seductive. There exists some evidence that the Cretan-Minoan civilization had ties to ancient Egypt. What if the original settlers of Crete were Damietan Kaftirim, who had left the mainland to lay down roots on the distant island of Crete? And what if these former Damietans then invaded Canaan by sea on their own or in concert with the army of their parent country, Kaftir? This may explain an apparent redundancy in the verse telling us that the Avim were annihilated by Kaftirim who went out of Kaftir. Is this perhaps a reference to Kaftirim who left Kaftir and had settled in Crete? If so, although Kaftir would not refer directly to Crete, its inhabitants could still be called Kaftirim on account of their place of origin. Furthermore, Kaftir, the Isle of Kaftir, in contrast to Kaftir proper, might well refer to Crete, an island inhabited by Kaftirim. We've circled back to the theory introduced and discounted earlier in the podcast. Ultimately, this enticing theory would hinge entirely on whether the first Cretans to settle the coast of Canaan were of earlier Minoan or later Mycenaean stock. The Mycenaeans were descended from the Greeks, not from the Egyptians. The archaeological record of the Philistine cities is mixed on this account, and is itself contingent upon the differing conventional and revised chronologies of the ancient world. A complete analysis of all of the relevant factors is beyond the scope of our discussion. In conclusion, the name Plishtim appears to be more of a geographic and ethnographic designation. The term was applied over time to a broad range of peoples of varying origins. The Neo-Philistine Confederacy came to a close at the time of the Churban. Any later occupants of these territories would bear no relation at all to any of the original groups, although they might very well be cut of a similar cloth. More on this in the next episode.